Ed today. He's got a degree in natural sciences from UCL, but has since worked in scientific publishing. He's currently the press officer at the Science Media Centre. And I won't tell you what the Science Media Centre is, because I think Ed's going to do that for us.
Yeah, that's great.
Cool. Great, I'll get started. So thanks for having me today. And sorry I couldn't be there in person. Stupidly, I didn't look that it was in Cambridge and thought it was in London, which is very London-centric of me. So apologies that I couldn't make it last minute. But yeah, I'm one of the press officers at the Science Media Centre. My talk might be a bit more possibly practical than Tamandra's, but I'll try and explain how it's relevant to today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what the Science Media Centre actually does, so what we do and why we exist, and the kind of important role of scientists and particularly maths and stats experts in helping journalists to explain to the public and give them the kind of best access to accurate and evidence-based kind of science reporting, and particularly on politicized and controversial scientific issues. And I think it kind of follows on nicely from Tamandra's talk, actually, especially the points about helping the public kind of understand uncertainty. So just some quick background. So we were set up in 2002, so about 24 years ago now. Basically, after a few huge stories in the media in the late 90s and early 2000s went really wrong, and the public were misinformed about kind of what the evidence was on those topics. So I'm showing some of the headlines, some of the doom-mongering headlines on the screen now, and a lot of those stories you'll probably remember. So the main one was MMR and autism, which has become really very relevant kind of again now, especially around all the stuff with Trump. GM crops, use of animals in research, and BSE mad cow disease. So they were all kind of really huge front page filling stories and very much in the public debate. And what was kind of noticeable at the time was the very scientists that have been working in those areas for 10, 20 years, having their voices heard in the media and helping to explain to the journalists and to the public what the actual state of the evidence was and all the nuances of the evidence. So it was kind of a frustration from all sides. So from journalists who would try and get in touch with those scientists, and there wasn't this maybe as good of a system of science communication and press officers as there is today. And it would mean that scientists might not reply to journalists or reply 2 weeks later, which obviously doesn't fit with the kind of demands of the news cycle, which has got even worse since it was 20 years ago now. And from the scientists who would listen to the radio or see these headlines and be dismayed by what the kind of doom-mongering and scaremongering there was in those headlines, and the public being misinformed about what the evidence was on those topics that have really important implications for kind of public health. So we were basically set up as an organization to bridge that gap. So when these kind of meaty, scary, long form, ongoing, scary, politicized kind of science stories come up in the news again, we can be ready, jump into action by knowing the best kind of scientists and maths and stats experts who can be ready to help us explain right from the start of the story what the actual state of the science and evidence is, to help make sure people actually understand what the evidence is saying and make their choices accordingly. So quickly, we're an independent press office for science, and our remit is specifically helping the kind of national news media in the UK primarily, although we've kind of added a few journalists on our list since the COVID pandemic went so global. So we've picked up journalists from some journalists in kind of Germany and Spain and the US now as well. But our main focus is helping those UK journalists and the UK public. So we're run as a charity, and we're funded by over 120 different organizations like universities, science journals, research charities, and some money from industry, but we remain kind of complete independence from each of those funders. We're not about kind of generating coverage of science in the news. We're very media led. So we just want to follow what the journalists are writing about, what the controversial stories in terms of science are of the day, and ensuring whatever coverage there is covered kind of accurately and with evidence base, and having scientists, independent scientists and scientists' voices heard. And so kind of on that, we don't have a particular editorial stance or position on any of these kind of scientific issues. We represent the scientific community and where the weight of the good quality scientific evidence is on those kind of issues as well. And like I said earlier, we focus on those kind of messy, controversial, complex, scary kind of science stories that might affect people's behavior or have kind of policy implications like vaccines, e-cigarettes, AI, climate change, mental health, and many more. And I'll give you some examples in a minute, kind of relevant to maths and stats of kind of how we actually try and achieve this. And kind of for all these topics, there's often really highly debated in the media, but when you actually speak to the scientific community, who are the ones who are doing the research on this, it's often a little bit less controversial. And there's these kind of evidence-based views of the scientists who actually work on these issues is what we try and get across to the journalists so that the public will be better informed as a result. Just very quickly, I just wanted to show some quite recent stats. Basically looking at where people get their sources of news. And as you can kind of see, even though print media is kind of going down, the traditional kind of news sources still have a really kind of high reach, and a big proportion of the public are still getting or having a look at these news sources. So this is again why it's important for kind of scientists to engage with these traditional news sources, because they still have a huge reach, and kind of any information in these that is kind of inaccurate or misleading or not representing what the scientific evidence is could then be misleading a huge proportion of the public as well. And then on the flip side, kind of what about what the public thinks of the voice of scientists and engineers and doctors and professors? So academics are really well trusted by the public, as you can see. So this is a kind of poll that you'll probably all know from Ipsos that they do every year, where they ask a representative group of the population if they trust each of these kind of different professions to tell them the truth. And scientists have always been really well trusted. So that's a really privileged position to have. And so, and we always kind of say this is something that's not shouldn't be taken for granted and is earned and not going to be inherently kept. So one way to do that is to kind of keep getting out there and speaking about your science, whether that's speaking to the public directly and kind of speaking through the Science Media Centre and doing what we do and speaking to the national news journalists, and kind of being seen as a well trusted and kind of evidence-based voice on these kind of issues. And also the kind of converse thing is that if scientists don't speak to the media, then someone else will. Like I said, it's a really demanding news cycle right now. And just because a scientist doesn't speak to a journalist doesn't mean that story will stop there. They might speak to a less well-qualified expert or get an additional quote from a campaigner or a scientist who's not in that direct field, and then you might wake up the next morning and see that article and be shouting at the screen saying, "Oh, if I'd done that, I would not have made that point at all. I would have made this point or been careful about saying that." So there's also kind of a risk of not engaging with the media as well. And then that's just exemplifying that there. So just really quickly about how we actually operate to achieve these goals. So over the lifetime of the SMC, we've built up a big database of contacts across the science world and the media world to allow us to kind of effectively bring them together. So 3,000 scientists across all kinds of different scientific discipline and stats experts as well. And they basically allow us to contact them when their area of science is in the news, or there's a new upcoming study that we might want to get their input on. And then we have all the press officers from the institutions that those scientists and experts are working at, and they keep us up to date on what research they've got coming out and help us find experts who can speak to journalists on all these kind of issues as well. And then lastly, we've also got a comprehensive list of all the kind of specialist science, health and environment reporters at all the UK national news outlets in the UK. And we're really up to date on that. It's important that we kind of know all of them and they trust in what we do, because otherwise, if they didn't use our output, then we wouldn't be able to have any impact on the public understanding of science. And I should say we specifically work with the kind of specialist reporters. And we're really lucky in the UK that we actually still have specialist science, health and environment reporters at all the kind of big national outlets in the UK, as they're the ones who've often been working on this 10, 20 years. They have a better understanding of, say, statistics and scientific method than a lot of the other kind of general news reporters. And for the most part, I won't speak in specifically general terms, but I really care about kind of getting it right and representing the evidence and helping the public to understand it. So now I'm just going to give you some examples of exactly what we do. And I've tried to pick some specific examples that are kind of relevant to all of you in the room. So kind of maths or AI and stats examples, so that you can get a flavor of how this big goal we have actually translates into making real world impacts for the public in terms of what they see in the news. So first, in just 1 second, journalist inquiries are kind of as they say. So any of these journalists that I mentioned can just get in touch with us and say, "Oh, I'm writing this story, but actually this bit of the statistics doesn't quite make sense to me. Can you find me a stats expert who can go through that with me?" Or I'm writing this new story about this new study on AI or this development in AI. Can you find me an AI expert to talk that through with me? And we'll try and find them an expert either to give a quote or an interview or go on the radio or anything basically that they might want. And they're often a really nice way to kind of dip your toes into media work, especially if it's just a kind of short quote. Because we can check that with you, the institutional press office can check that with you, and then that can have a real impact into, say, an article in the Times coming out the next day, in helping get a third-party perspective on an issue or a new study. So the first kind of main thing that we do is what we call rapid reaction. So they're basically responses from experts into kind of breaking news stories that have an element of science to them. So we monitor the news every day in our office. When we say kind of story brewing or immediately breaking, where scientists can weigh in and help inform the public as to what's going on, we jump into action and go to the database that I mentioned earlier and go to the relevant experts on the topic and ask them kind of what can we say about the situation right now? what can't we say, what's the evidence, how do these statistics look like, how do they compare to maybe what other people are saying in the news about the stats, should we be worried, all those kind of things that we know the public and the journalists will be interested in writing about immediately after these kind of big breaking stories. So we just send out those comments in real time as kind of relevant scientific experts come back to us. And as these are often the kind of headline stories of the day, and they can often be quite scary stories, there's a huge appetite from the media to kind of hear from scientists and have them contribute to that story. So it's really an amazing opportunity for scientists to get their expertise in the media, but it's often when the public are kind of most scared or engaged. So it's important they hear from the kind of best experts qualified to comment on that situation. And journalists, again, are under more pressure than ever, and they're often working on multiple stories a day. I think we recently heard that some journalists sometimes have to write up to 8 stories a day now. And it might be a subject they never covered before, but their news desk will be kind of asking them for an article ASAP. And they might not have even had a background of this before. So this is where this kind of comments can give a really good background and help them get quotes from really qualified experts to help inform that story, which they might not necessarily have enough time to do otherwise. So it can be a really important resource for them. So the example of the kind of story that I wanted to show today was one that we'll probably remember from the COVID pandemic, which is when there was reports of kind of rare adverse side effects from the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And we got experts to comment on the latest kind of yellow card data from the MHRA and the reported number of brain clots. So obviously getting the coverage of this right was of vital importance for public health in the pandemic. This was a really worrying side effect that it's important to make the public aware of, but it's a very rare one, and it could people off taking the kind of COVID vaccine and vaccines in general, when it was important that we got so many people to get their vaccines at that time. So we kind of gathered comments from qualified scientists and statisticians that really helped kind of explain the statistics of how rare these events are, talking about kind of differences in different age groups and the potential impacts of kind of delaying the vaccination program because of this. So here's just to show you some of the comments we sent out. This one from Professor David Waring, just talking specifically about, again, what I mentioned, putting into context the number of cases, which were 22, are among the 18 million receiving the vaccine. And even simple things like we're just explaining clearly the absolute risks, which to stats experts might seem like really rudimentary, to journalists and the journalists can sometimes struggle to understand these things. But so by really breaking these simple things down, it can really help to improve the story and improve the coverage and help the public understand the kind of rarity of these side effects. And then just this comment I wanted to highlight from Professor David Spiegelhalter as well. Again, talking about the kind of risk being very low and kind of giving thoughts about what would happen if we delayed the vaccination program as well, and putting that into context as well. And then just to quickly show you kind of the impact that these comments have, like I said, they're used directly in the piece, and they also give a general context that can help influence the piece of the journalist as well. So these comments that I just showed you, both really nicely highlighted in this piece in the Financial Times. And that was just one example of many, but I can't show you all of them because I only had 20 minutes to speak to you today, but it was used in many other pieces as well. And this piece in the Eye as well, where David was quoted, and amongst other experts as well. I'll come back onto this later as well, but another thing we do is we run kind of media briefings on kind of relevant topics as well. So because this story was an ongoing story, it was going on for several days, it was in the news a lot, we basically set up a question and answer briefing with a few scientists to help break down those statistics and kind of what it actually means with these side effects, what might be causing them, and kind of how does it mean, can we say the vaccines are still safe, to really help explain to the journalists the kind of relative safety of the vaccines and kind of what the risks are and what we can't say and what we can say. So this is just to show you what the invite looked like. We sent out to journalists, and obviously, as we know, COVID was a huge story at the time, and this was a really big story for a few weeks during one part of the pandemic. So we got 47 journalists coming along from all the kind of main news outlets in the UK and further afield to come and listen to these scientists really clearly explain what the evidence is, what the statistics are saying around the risks of these vaccines, which is really amazing to see. And this is just a picture of my colleague Fiona and the scientists at that media briefing, obviously online because it was during the pandemic. And then the reason I wanted to show this was just because some of particularly this Sun headline, which I always kind of quote in talks, just showing the kind of power of stats in showing the kind of rarity of side effects. Like, who would have imagined that on the Sun front page they'd have ran a 0.00005 kind of absolute risk of the tiny chance of this AstraZeneca vaccine, which is a really, really nice way and powerful way of demonstrating the kind of rarity of that, and that it doesn't mean just because there was a couple of side effects that we should delay or put off a whole vaccination program. So I just thought that was a really nice way to finish that example. Next up are our roundups, which are basically one of the unique things we do at the Science Media Centre. So just quickly, in most areas of science, the research gets into the news is through a kind of press release from the university, the journal, or the research funder that did that research. So we're in a really privileged position at the SNC in that we're on the same email list that all the journalists are on, so we receive all the same press releases they do. So we can kind of know what stories might be coming up in the next few days and what they might cover. So we look through those press releases and kind of decide whether we think journalists will cover it, and also whether we think we could add something to that story. So it might be that it's a highly controversial or politicized topic. It might be that it's a very complex new bit of science. It might be that the statistics have a chance to be kind of sensationalized or misreported. And then obviously that result of that is the public being misinformed or the story being exaggerated. And that can have really damaging implications. So what we do here is we again go to our database and kind of seek third-party comments critiquing that new piece of research to help guide any journalists as to all those kind of questions I just mentioned there. So it's kind of like a mini peer review. So the kind of questions are kind of what type of study is it? Or is it observational? Is it a randomized control trial? And what does that mean? Is it good quality research? Are the conclusions backed up by the data and the stats? Are there any confounders and limitations or any of this over speculation? So those can often be quite easy for a scientist to understand, but the journalists, even though we have science and health reporters, can sometimes struggle to understand some of those elements of the paper. So by scientists providing those comments, it can really help journalists to understand the kind of significance of the study. The example I wanted to show you was of a roundup we did in a paper that was due to be published in the journal JAMA Network Open, which was kind of suggesting that use of weight loss drugs, so like semaglutide or Ozempic, and liraglutide were associated with increased risk in suicidality. So weight loss drugs have been one of the biggest stories in the media over the last couple of years, and the media interest hasn't waned at all. And firstly, from the kind of amazement of the clinical trials, how successful they were, and then kind of onto the other benefits they might have, like reducing heart disease, reducing alcohol consumption, gambling, and then kind of endless kind of debate over whether it's kind of cheating or to lose weight using weight loss drugs as well. So they're very much in public discussion right now. But another thing that the journalists would always report on is the kind of every single possible side effect, because they were such an in vogue drug to discuss. So like Ozempic face and Ozempic ban, but also the more serious ones like blindness or in this case suicidality. So that's a really scary side effect of a commonly used and a commonly used medication that's a really important medication. And it's on a very media-friendly topic, as I've said. There's still stories about weight loss drugs in the news every single day, basically. So we're sure it's going to be a story, and it's quite a scary story. But how strong is the actual evidence to kind of back up that claim? So this is just the kind of press release that we received. So obviously this study is a kind of association study, so it can't prove causality here. Also has the study kind of accounted for the fact there could be a reverse association at play, where people who are kind of obese or overweight might be struggling to lose weight, and then they might be more likely to be depressed or suicidal. Is it a good quality where the conclusions are backed up by strong evidence? Are there any major limitations to highlight? So those are all the kind of questions that we can ask scientists and stats experts to kind of look into in the study, and then send out those kind of mini peer review comments to the journalists. So then here's some of the comments that we sent out, including one from Kevin McConway, who's in the room. I can see him there. That really nicely and clearly just pointing out a lot of the kind of limitations and really simply helping to highlight stuff that will be really important for the public to know about this study. That are then, and some more comments that I won't go through in the interest of time, but also from kind of pharmacovigilance experts and statistics experts who are all kind of qualified to comment on different aspects of the study that can really helpfully clearly explain what this study can tell us and also what it can't tell us. And as you can see, these are really useful. So this is a piece in the Mail Online, and like half the article is there being quoted from all these different experts giving their thoughts on what are the severe limitations of the study and can we exactly take it at face value. And even though the kind of headline might be slightly sensationalized sometimes in these cases, at least below the piece we have all these amazing scientists who can help really explain, put it into context and help kind of keep it a bit toned down compared to where it might have been if they hadn't engaged with those journalists. In this kind of case as well, the quotes can even have the impact of kind of killing a story, because the scientists can kind of put such a lack of doubt in the journalist's mind as to the strength of the study and that it might worry the public in that they don't cover it at all. So in this case, there's a couple of really nice quotes where Kevin's comment, amongst others, actually helped stop two journalists covering the story at all because it was too early to confidently say that on that association. And then just lastly, I'm not aware if I'm going over time or not, but I'll be very quick. I wanted to just come back to the kind of media briefings that I started discussing earlier. So we run two main types of briefings: background briefings and news briefings. News briefings are kind of pegged to a new study or report, and they're a great way for the authors of that new study to kind of set the agenda on their results, kind of presenting it to the journalists in their own way. Having a bit more control over the way it's explained before it comes out in the media, and really explaining the kind of nuances, caveats, taking their time to go through all the details of why they did what they did, how they did it. And then they can also, it's a really nice opportunity for journalists to just probe the scientists and ask the scientists any questions they have about their study and really dig into that and make sure the scientists are getting it right and that they understand everything correctly as well. And then background briefings, which I kind of alluded to a bit earlier, so they're a bit different from news briefings. They're not pegged to a new study. They give a kind of broad background or Q&A on a relevant area of science that can really help the journalist to understand that issue in a bit more detail. So it could be a kind of cutting edge area of science the journalists haven't talked about much before. So I'm organising one for next week actually about kind of driverless cars in London, because there's going to be a trial of driverless taxis. So that can have four experts in that field really digging in and having a Q&A about what the kind of state of the current evidence is. Or an example like I showed earlier about kind of a teach-in about an ongoing relevant story that's going on the news, like the vaccine side effect story from COVID. So I just wanted to quickly show you, as I didn't want all of my examples to be about statistics, this is an example of a news briefing I ran a few months ago on a new kind of generative AI model, which is called the Delphi 2M model, which was from the EMBL. And it basically used anonymized large-scale health records to estimate how a person's health how an individual's risk of diseases might change over the next couple of decades, and predicts kind of what diseases they might get based on a whole load of health information about themselves. So AI has been a huge topic of discussion for the last few years, since the launch of ChatGPT, with discussions about it being our savior or doom, impact on society, impacts on kind of health and drug discovery, just being a few of the things that have been discussed about it. This model could be an important tool that could help a lot of people inform their risk of disease in the future, but there's also a lot of concern about these kind of new AI models generally, including about how accurate they are, whether they actually protect people's data sufficiently, or whether they'll hallucinate and make up things about people's health, which is obviously can have really grave implications. And also kind of more specifically with this model, there's kind of issues around how accurate does it get as the predictions become further and further away, and the model is including more and more assumptions as it gets decades into the future, and whether it can tell someone about their individual risk or their population level risk, and what the kind of difference is between that, as that might be quite difficult for the public to understand, and what actual real world uses will they have for people. So that means all of those kind of complex questions means it's the opportunity for the developers of this model to explain exactly what the model can do and what it can't do on a kind of press conference with the journalists, and really dig into all of that. So this is just the invite that we sent out to journalists, including the members of the group that led on this project from EMBL. And it was attended widely by a lot of journalists, a lot of UK outlets, and then also some specialist outlets and outlets abroad as well. And then just to show you that this kind of leads to some really nice coverage in the BBC, and that briefing that piece will have been helped by having those scientists make themselves available to the journalists to answer any questions they have and really help explain that in a kind of clear and understandable way and make sure the journalist gets it. And then just this piece in The Guardian and in the Mirror as well, which is really nice to see. So those are just a flavour of the kind of topics we work on at the S&C, and I've just part of some of the other ones that we work on here as well. And kind of in a lot of those topics, there's a role for kind of maths and statistics to have a voice in helping to break down what the implications of studies in these areas are, so that the public can really understand what the data is showing us. And then thanks for listening to me. Here's my contact details. So we'll go on to questions in a bit, but I just hope I explained to you the kind of important role that maths and stats can have in improving the kind of public understanding and trust of topical science issues of the day, and the kind of role that the news media has in that. And if there's any scientists or stats experts in the room who are interested in kind of signing up to our database, then please write down my email and get in touch with me. I'd be really happy to have a further chat with you. And we're always looking for more great experts to add onto our list. So thanks so much, everyone.